Okay, welcome to week 2 of Basic Television. And this unit is going to cover some of how television works and the technology involved and a little bit of the history. Now, the reason why you want to know the history is because a lot of the things that are very common in television are based on technology that no longer exists. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily right or wrong, good or bad, but it is what it is. So a lot of people you will meet in the television industry now are used to things working a slightly different way. And that can be an advantage to you, but at the same time, it's always helpful to understand how things used to work. And part of that's going to involve the interlaced scanning system and a few other things. Okay, the stages of cinematographic history. So there we're going to digress a little bit and go way, way, way back to before we really had the kind of technology that even resembles this. And so let's talk for a minute about film. Now, you're not necessarily going to be expected to be an expert of film history, but it might be good to understand some of the principles that made it work. Now, film is based on optical principles, but also chemical principles. Now, the chemical part is kind of important. And the reason why I say that is because the optical principles haven't changed since then. So this is from the early 1900s, the early turn of the last century. We have cinematography, we have the motion picture, and we have lenses, cameras, and projectors. And all of those things use some elements that have not changed. Television cameras also have lenses, and they also use lighting, etc. And so the difference is with cinematographic film, with the history of film, back in the beginning, the only way to store an image was through a chemical reaction. So you would literally have a piece of film in the back of the camera that had a chemical coating on it that reacted to light. And this is a photograph. And so the film held a chemical emulsion that reacted to light and retained an image. And then that film was developed and then it could be projected. Now this device, this chemical film, the camera would shoot 24 separate photographic images per second. And the projector would project 24 separate photographic images per second. So if you held up a piece of film to the light, you would see little bitty tiny film images. You'd see little photographs all in a row. And the projector would be basically flashing those at you at a pretty fast rate. Okay, and those were projected onto a screen with a bright light. That's what the projector was for, and that's basically how film went. Now, film also depended on a principle that never changes, called the persistence of vision. And the way to understand the persistence of vision is that your eye holds an after image of what you see for a brief instant after you've seen it. So if anyone's ever taken a flash picture of you, you might notice that you still have that spot in your eye for a few seconds. And so, when you see an image projected very quickly with a pulse of light, and then you get darkness, you still see that image for an instant. Then when another image comes in that's slightly different, you'll actually merge those two. And that is how cinematography works. You see 24 images per second, but you don't see that as separate images. You see that as one long, consistent image. And that is how we get the motion picture. And again, this goes way back to the turn of the century. And if you look at photographic history, that goes way back into the previous century, into the 19th century. So the Civil War photography and stuff like that. So the photograph is a lot older than the motion picture. But the motion picture really was brought in at the beginning of the 20th century and had a lot to do with how we got to where we are. Okay. And understanding this, if you see, these are some images here. The film camera, as you can see, would hold, use this, these would be large rolls of film, and film looks kind of like this. It's this plasticky material that has sprocket holes in it. And then you can see that the projector basically runs reels of this through this illumination system, and that's how we see film. And of course, I assume that most of you already knew that. But that's not to say that some of you may never have seen it. Who knows? Okay, television is a little bit different. So television is another step, and believe it or not, it isn't the last one. So television involves electronics. Now, film does not. Film involves chemical reactions. Television does not involve chemical reactions at all. Television is strictly electronic. And so just to put a fine point on it, if you were shooting film in the early turn of the 20th century, if you were, say, 1902, you were shooting film, you don't necessarily have to have electricity. You can have a wind-up camera, and you can be shooting film all day, just cranking the camera up or just turning the crank as you go, which some of those old cameras did. You wouldn't need electricity at all. And at the same time, if you were operating a television camera, obviously you need electricity, but there would be no chemicals involved. There'd be no developing film necessarily or anything like that. And so there's a big divide between television and film. Okay, and television and video started in 1939. So video is the science of television. Television is more like a phenomenon where it's through the airwaves and you're seeing television images, you got the television industry. The actual making of video or making of television uses video technology. That's the difference between those two words. And again, this started in 1939. So television uses what's called a cathode ray tube, which is, or it used to use, there's a long glass tube with an electron gun on it, and it writes the image onto a glowing surface. I'm going to show you a picture of that in a minute because I don't expect you to be able to visualize it. This sort of thing would be, if they were describing it today, it would sound like some kind of a torture device. It's very primitive by today's standards. In fact, if you've seen The Simpsons, where they showed Homer Simpson's first television, you see his shadow on the wall from where he sat in front of it. It's almost literally that horrible to think that we were using these. Now, the television image is based on 525 lines. Now, that's like television writes lines down from the top of the frame down to the bottom, and it creates 30 complete images per second. And that is what we call the NTSC television standard. Now, video cameras create the same signal that television monitors display. And so there's no film involved. In fact, if you were using what you would think of as television technology, you wouldn't even necessarily need wires. You would basically have a television camera that would create the signal, send it out somewhere, and then a television would pick it up. Or, of course, it's even easier to use a wire just to plug it from the output of the camera to the input of the TV monitor, and you're seeing it exactly what the television camera is generating. And of course, the persistence of vision remains the same. Now there, we have to explain a slight caveat, and I'll do that after I've shown you this next image. Now, this is what television used to look like. Just to show you how primitive it actually was, if you see over here, we have an early television camera, probably not going quite back to 1939, but not that much farther away. And over here, this is what a television set might have looked like. They were very small, very big, very expensive. The screen was small, the television itself was huge and heavy and fragile. To be honest, I'm not even sure it's safe to watch those things, because of the radiation coming off of them. And then, of course, you had videotape, this is the kind of tape that we use kind of at the beginning of this whole cycle. So it was just plain horrible. Now, to go on to television technology, if you look at, let's say this image here is a television set, and this is basically cut in half, and you can see this half an hourglass shape here. That was the picture tube, or the cathode ray tube, and that's featured up here and over here. In the back of the tube, you would have a very strong electrical gun, they called it. They called it an electron gun that shoots negatively charged particles forward towards the front surface of the screen. So the front here, that's where you would be looking, in front of this glass tube here. And so you would have a stream of lightning essentially going from the back of the screen to the front of the screen, and it would basically cause the surface of that glass to glow. And so that would be coated with phosphorus. You would have this glowing image. And these magnets that you see listed here, magnetic coils, would guide where that lightning would strike the front surface of the screen. And you can see with this diagram here that it would draw lines. The intensity would vary, so some of the areas are going to be lighter or darker than the others. And as it goes from the top of the screen to the bottom, it creates the picture. So that's literally how this used to work. And it used to take a few minutes to warm up, and then when you turn it off, it would still be hot for a while. Sometimes these things would give off smoke because they would generate so much heat. And so I'm very thankful that we don't have to use these anymore. Now, the problem with the persistence of vision is that, and this is a problem that was also true of film, film we said operates at 24 frames a second. But the persistence of vision only works if you can get better than 30 frames a second. And so even 30 frames a second really isn't good enough. In fact, it really wants to be closer to 60. So how did they solve this problem? Well, in the film days, what they would do is they would shoot 24 frames a second, no problem. Because if they shot 50 frames a second on film, they would run out of film very quickly. And so what they would do is the projector would project each image twice. So you would effectively get closer to 50 images per second. And so that's how you would avoid the flickering effect. They used to call motion pictures the flicks because of that reason. And so the more stable motion picture had a projector which basically just showed you each frame twice, and so you wouldn't notice the difference except that it would be a more stable image. Now in the case of television, if we only give you 30 images per second, that's going to be very jarring, very annoying. It's going to flicker like crazy. And so what they chose to do, because at the time they couldn't get the technology to scan any faster, what they would do is they would give you only the odd lines first. So line 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, etc. And then when the electron gun reached the bottom of the frame, it would go back up again and start with 2, 4, 6, 8. And this would happen, every 60th of a second. So you would be getting 2 fields or 2 halves of a frame every second. And so that would give you 30 frames a second, but it would be more solid. So that's basically how that worked. Okay, television standards, real quick, because this was important to the development of television, and it's important that you understand because it's still a problem to this day. In 1939, once again, America created a television standard known as NTSC, which operates with 525 scanning lines at 30 frames per second. And so, to say that America invented this is a true statement. But that's not to say that the Europeans wouldn't have been involved if they weren't already busy doing something else. So in 1939, there was a war going on, so they weren't really interested in television, which is one of the reasons why America made it first. But America also got the worst television standard, because Europe got into television at the conclusion of World War II, roughly 1950, and the European standard that's used in England, Germany, and most other European countries operates at 625 scanning lines per frame. And so, if you want to think about that image of the scanning lines, if you wanted to make a more detailed picture, you would need more lines. And so they've got 100 more lines, which actually is significantly better. Now, the one problem they did have was that they're scanning at a slower rate, and that has to do with their electrical system. So they're scanning at 25 frames per second, or really 50 fields per second, because we talked about the interlaced scanning system. And that we're going to talk more about how that fits into high-definition television in a minute. But they're getting effectively 50 fields per second, which is going to flicker just a little bit, but they're getting a much sharper image. And this all happened at the end of World War II. Now, France was the only European country that did not use PAL. They used CCAM, and most of Eastern Europe and the Middle East adopted one version or another of CCAM, which also has 620 scanning lines at 25 frames per second, but there's a slightly different color encoding system. So really, if you were looking at CCAM on a PAL television system, it would just show up in black and white. Whereas, if you try to play PAL on an American television system, it's going to try to turn 625 lines into 525 lines, and it's not going to be able to do that. So it's going to flip. The picture's going to roll, and the audio is going to sound all garbled and fast because it's simply impossible for it to display the information that way. The only way you can do that is to convert it electronically. And so this was a big handicap for the television industry. And there's basically two reasons why we have television standards. The first is having to do with the history of television. Because, as I said, America got it first, but that means that they get the worst system. Because once you invest, you're stuck. You know, it's kind of like buying a house. You know, once you move in, it's not all that easy to move out. You got to do a lot of things that you don't want to have to do. And so, for example, if you bought a television set, you know, because this would be a big investment, by the way. This would be like the equivalent of a few $1,000s. This is like buying a car would be today. So you buy a television set, and you're getting 525 lines. Let's say that along comes PAL, and let's say that America wants to adopt PAL on a better television. That means you're going to have to throw that TV set away. There's nothing you can do with it. It cannot be adapted or changed. You basically have to heave it out the window and get another one. Well, maybe not out the window, but you got to get rid of it. And so that meant that you have just wasted a huge amount of money. And the same thing was true of TV broadcasters. They bought all their cameras. It's like, well, those cameras aren't going to work because they use NTSC and not PAL. So therefore, America was literally stuck with NTSC, which is sometimes called never the same color. They were stuck with that horrible standard until very recently. Okay, standards conversion. I said that it's impossible to play NTSC on PAL and vice versa, but you can, if you've got a lot of money, get an electronic system that would convert it. And it's not as hard as it used to be, but back then it was a real bear. Those systems were amazingly expensive, and if you hire someone to do it, it was amazingly expensive. And so that was not a very easy solution. Okay, high definition television. Let's finally move out of that realm. Now you might think, well, what's the difference? It's not electronic. High definition television is digital. Now I'm going to put a big dividing line here between digital and electronic. Electronics is when you've got tubes, diodes, resistors, and all these different things. Now, yes, you do have those in computers, but believe it or not, that's not the same thing, because the signal is not processed by an electronic means. It's processed using RAM memory. It's simulated. Computer technology simulates the electronics that television use. So yes, the computer has its own electronics, but that's the only electronics that you're using. So it's creating the impression of television. And so this happened, say, roughly the beginning of the 21st century. We didn't even realize this was happening. The dirty little secret is your television gradually turned into a computer. That's really the way it worked, and I can't really say it any other way. Meaning that if you bought a new television, chances are it was a digital television, you just didn't notice it. And then, eventually, they did that thing where they went from broadcasting in analog to broadcasting in digital, and by that time you probably had cable TV, so you didn't notice it. Or if you did have broadcast TV, you were given free a little converter system that would take care of that for you. Computer technology mimics digital scanning without the need of a CRT. I doubt very seriously that your television of today uses a CRT. Most likely it's a flat panel screen, kind of like a laptop screen, and it mimics those scanning lines and lines of resolution. Instead of scanning lines, we have rows of pixels that are lit up, and there's no big electron gun that's going to electrocute the heck out of you if you accidentally punch your fist through it or something like that if you don't like the show. And now we have 1,080 lines per frame instead of 525, and at 60 frames per second, at least potentially, that's high definition television. And so let me qualify that also. Because of the nature of the technology, HD TV can vary and improve faster. So for example, you've heard the term 4K, or yeah, 4K is what they're calling it. That is literally 4 times the resolution of high definition television. So we've gone from having incredibly bad television to what really is a dream 1080 lines instead of 525. But now you can go ahead and multiply that by whatever factor you want, and you'll get more and more resolution, and you don't have to buy a new television. Your television may not be able to display 4K, but 4K will be converted down for you because your television is basically a computer. Because the computer is just mimicking all this. And so, in fact, when you stream movies on Netflix, I'm sorry to say, you're probably not seeing them in high definition. They're probably being down converted for bandwidth's sake, and you just don't notice the difference. Okay, tape versus nonlinear. You are extremely lucky you don't have to work with tape. Tape had all kinds of problems. First of all, you had generation loss. When video was electronic in nature, you basically had an electronic machine creating it and an electronic machine playing it back. And these machines would interpret the signal in their own way. So you have one machine recording it, it's doing the best it can to get the color right. Then you play that tape on another machine, it may look vastly different because the interpretation may be off. And then when you go and take that tape and record it to another tape, it's never going to be as good because it's an approximation. And then if you take that tape and record it again to another tape, it gets worse and worse and worse. Also, tapes get damaged. In fact, even brand new tapes sometimes have defects in them. What do you do about that? That's a problem. Rewinding and shuttling. And this may be hard for you to remember, and I'm talking because I know that most of you are very young, so you might not remember videotapes like VHS or Beta, where at the end of the movie you hit the rewind button and it takes a good 2 or 3 minutes to get all the way back to the beginning of the tape. Now, if you were doing video editing that way and you had one scene on one end of the tape, one scene on the other, you got to shuttle back and forth a long time to get all the footage off of that tape, which is a real pain in the butt. Also, you have what we're going to call linear traps, because in order to edit, you were literally re-recording footage. And so you got your footage in one machine, you're recording onto a master tape, and then when you get to the end of that scene, you put another tape in the machine on the playback side, put something else on the master tape, and then you move on. You're recording it. So let's say somebody says, you know, I changed my mind. That scene we put in, back 2 or 3 edits. We want to remove that. Well, guess what? You can't, because it's already there. So if you were to blank it out, you would have a gap in the movie that you will always have. It would just a black screen for a few seconds, however long that is. So you would literally have to replace it with something that's exactly the same length, or you would have to go back and redo all the edits from that point onward, which I'll give you a little secret here. As an editor, because I was working as an online editor, if a client ever suggested that, all I'd have to do is tell them, well, that's going to take an extra 2 or 3 hours, and they're paying for the time in the room, which was like $150 an hour. That would usually make up their mind pretty quickly. Whereas in non-linear editing, you don't have that problem, so you would basically just do it because it took less time to remove the scene than it would be to even talk about it. Okay, random access is a computer term. Random access memory is RAM, and computer disks are random access. And now we're not even using disks anymore. We're using just these amorphous cards, which basically have the same effect. So you can access any information on the disk, let's just say instantly, and it works. Okay, why do we care about this? Why do we care about this technology? First of all, even today, video is still recorded and played back in frames. And so the same terminology applies. So you would have frames in film, those little pictures. You have frames in video that you're counting 30 frames per second. Usually it's still 30 according to the editor. And so all those things are going to be the same. Lines are now rows of pixels, but they still work the same way. And so if you look at a scope and you're identifying problems in the video signal, you can probably figure out about where that is in the frame. Aspect ratio is something that's also changed, and I don't talk about that as much as I used to. The original television aspect ratio was square, almost square. It was 4 by 3, 4 units wide by 3 units tall. Now it's closer to 16 by 9, which is a little bit wider, gives you that cinematographic look, more film-like. But now you got people shooting on their cell phone cameras, and so now we have a vertical aspect ratio, which is the ratio between the width to the height. You should hold your camera like this, but nobody does. I don't know why. Everyone's shooting like this, but that's okay. And time code and frame rates, you can choose what those are. So for example, when you set up a video camera, you can decide whether you want to record on NTSC, standard definition television. I don't know why you would, but you can. You can also decide if you want to record in 720 or 1080 or 4K or whatever the camera is capable of generating. You can make that decision. You also get to decide between the progressive, or so for example 1080p and 1080i. 1080i is interlaced, and that goes back to 30 frames a second, 60 fields per second. 1080p is progressive, where you're actually getting 60 complete images per second. Optical principles and resolution remain the same. That much is not going to change. TV standards and formats still exist. There still is a PAL and an NTSC. Even high-definition versions of these television standards still are called by the same names because they still may have the different frame rates, and you have to know what you're doing now. And so you get to pick which format you're going to use, but you must be consistent. You can set up your camera any way you want, and you can set up your editing any way you need to, but you have to understand what format you're working in and why. And we still view video much the same way we used to. We still see it in a linear fashion, and it still works very much the same way. Editing is a lot easier, but the same principles apply. With film, you might edit with a razor blade and a piece of tape to put the film together. In video, you still are using shots and scenes, and you're putting it together in a linear fashion. The difference is now, if you had to cut something out of the middle, you certainly could, and you also now have the ability to layer video upon video after the fact. It's just gotten a whole lot easier. Okay, the workflow. I want you to understand this. This is towards the end of what we're going to be talking about today. The camera generates the footage. So your camera is generating the video signal, and now it's recording it also. You're going to shoot in shots. When I say that, shots and takes. So for example, let's say that you're shooting somebody delivering a speech. You may have a wide shot of that person, or you may have a close-up of that person, and maybe you're going to record the same speech twice. And so you got a shot where it's wide and a shot where it's close, and maybe you have a shot from another angle or something along those lines. It could be you're shooting more shots at the same time. Or if you've got an actor delivering a speech, maybe you do it several times until you feel you've got it right. The footage is stored in digital files that must be organized, and this is something that still, to this day, has not changed. When I was working as a video editor, people would come in with large boxes of tapes. And I mean, it looks like they're moving in. They've literally got cartloads of tapes that they're bringing in. And a lot of times, more times than you would believe, they'd have no idea what was on them. And then it was their job to put together a program, and they would say, give me the tape that's blue. Oh, no, the red one. And it's got a scratch on it. Look in the corner for a scratch. Somebody wrote on it with magic marker. And so then they put that one. I think that's towards the end of the tape, but they wouldn't be able to give me a time code reference. And so for that reason, they would lose a lot of time and spend a lot of money. And since I was getting paid salary, I would have to face, working all through the night, because they weren't prepared. And so the same thing can actually apply here as well, because now suddenly you can walk in with a single card that has all of your footage on it, but you can have 20 hours on there. And if you haven't got it organized and you don't know where things are, that can be a pain in the butt. Okay, editing involves assembling the final product based on the clip. So basically you're doing it the same way. It's just you no longer have to load multiple tapes. You no longer have to shuttle. You can organize them in a much easier fashion. And final editing includes mixdown, effects, and distribution. So you can put in stereo music, 5.1 surround sound. You might have effects that you apply after principal photography, and etc. Now, multi versus single camera. I wanted to make sure that we understand where this fits into the scheme. The video switcher, if you're shooting multi-camera, your individual cameras are selectable. So you are selecting what camera gets recorded while they're all on. So if you're doing a multi-camera shoot, you can have up to maybe 10 people out there. It's like a football game. You may have 10, 15 cameras. And so you have all those little windows and those little video monitors. And so the director hits a button, and that's the one that gets put on the air. And so that's how multi-camera works. Single camera, if you're going to shoot several different angles, you'd have to shoot the scene more than once or have more than one camera that you're recording in isolated fashion. Now, if something is live, and this particularly applies to multi-camera shooting, but nowadays you see people doing with single camera. If something is live, it means that it's happening while you're watching it. So basically, if you have a live news show, for example, you could have someone talking into the camera. It's being broadcast out to the world, and there are people watching it while this person is talking, and whatever is happening on that stage, people are seeing it real time. Now, live on tape means that they're doing it live. And so there's someone operating the switcher, deciding what shot goes where. And if they make a mistake, they usually just go on and hope that nobody noticed it. But they may be doing it, they may be recording it, but they may not be broadcasting it. So they have an extra opportunity to maybe fix any mistakes that they can. Now, film style is not live at all. That basically means you can shoot it 100 times if you want to until you feel it's right. And then you don't get a finished product until you're done editing each shot by each shot, and that can take weeks. Scripted, semi-scripted, and post-scripted. Now, once again, if you're shooting a multi-camera scene, this like, for example, an interview show. Let's say it's an interview show. Chances are, when your interviewer asks the question, the talent that they're asking the question of does not know exactly what they're going to say. So, but the interviewer might know the question. That would be semi-scripted. If it's not scripted at all, then it could be just you don't even know what the interviewer is going to say. If it were fully scripted, it wouldn't really be an interview show. It would be a drama about an interview show, which could very well be. So, for example, your news anchor could be reading from a teleprompter. It could be that they're saying exactly what's written in front of them, and it could be it's fully scripted. That's possible to do. Or if something's post-scripted, that would mean that the script comes after the interview. So if you're shooting something single camera, you're asking somebody a question, you're letting them answer it. You don't know what they're going to say, but you will then write down everything that they said and put together the script after you're shooting it. So that's post-scripted. And so that's what you would base the edits on. And principal photography versus B-roll. In multi-camera work, this usually doesn't happen. Everything is principal photography. If you're shooting single camera, you would get the stuff that's critical, like, for example, the actors delivering the lines, or the event, if you're shooting an event. And B-roll might be images that you could put in over that to fix mistakes or to provide more visual variety. Now, these days, after I've said all this, we are now moving in a different direction. Now we're starting to talk about streaming video, cloud storage, where we no longer have the same exact tools to work with. Eventually, we may not be using tapes at all, no cables or anything like that. We may just be streaming into some cloud somewhere and then editing into that cloud and then putting together. And so it could be that we simply don't operate with recording media at all. I resist that because I feel that it gives us less control, but that's not to say that the industry won't go that way. We certainly do appear to be going that way in terms of people watching television, because you don't see as many video stores anymore. You still have them, but they're just not as active. Now suddenly most people have these Netflix subscriptions and things like that, and so that will change things yet again. And so we're losing some of these standards. For example, I don't like this. I don't like it when people shoot vertically, but they do. And I simply have to accept that. That is part of the world we live in. Fortunately, it still actually works. If you were to try to do something like this, say 40 years ago, you would break the camera. Or if you didn't, you would create an image that simply wouldn't work. It would be sideways on the television set at home. If you tried to turn the television, something would go wrong. So it simply wouldn't have been a possibility. Or it would have been rejected by the television station. We can't air that because it doesn't meet the standards. Now suddenly, you can air whatever you want. Look at YouTube. They got all kinds of crazy things going on there. So that's both good and bad. I would argue that production values still matter. So there we are at the end of another. And so basically, the purpose of this lecture was to introduce video technology to you and to tell you how we got to where we are now. And this week in the hands-on section, we'll demonstrate video recording and video cameras and how they work. And then we'll also talk about cameras and lenses.